Before I begin, I'd like to know maybe who's in the audience. So who is currently playing maybe a lead developer role of some sort? Okay. Some sort of architect, maybe? Is there like an engineering manager? Okay. Maybe people who are maybe just developers? Okay, cool. So we have a good mix of different sort of mix of audience. And one of the reasons I put this talk together is that within the company that I work for, I am sort of responsible for a program that trains developers to take up the role of what we call a tech lead, maybe a lead developer, engineering manager. And one of the interesting experiences I've seen is that the sort of activities that you do as a developer, so the writing of the code, trying to understand what the problem is, trying to model some of that stuff, it doesn't really prepare you for taking on some of this leadership responsibility. And so one of the goals that I hope to achieve today is to transfer a few sets of models, tools and techniques about how you might achieve the Geek's Guide to Leading Teams. So I work for a company called ThoughtWorks. You might know us through Chief Scientist Martin Fowler, or through the work that we do with continuous delivery lean enterprise. You might also be interested in our sort of tech radar, which we actually just published in November, which talks about our sort of trends that we see around the world with our clients around things that sort of companies are adopting or we're sort of seeing less use of because there's problems associated with that. And my background is kind of leading teams, so I write code as well. But I also work as a sort of architect, and I'm very passionate about learning, hence the book about sort of retrospectives. I'm also interested in about people's stories about how they became sort of on their journey as being a sort of tech lead. And that's what this book about talking with tech leads is about, which you can sort of win in the sort of Megamind challenge. But the first question I want to sort of ask is, why do we even need this tech lead? So what is the point of this? And often when I think about sort of goals of systems, we write software for a purpose. Normally it's some sort of business sort of thing, perhaps it's a personal project, but normally we have a goal in mind. And when we have personal projects, it's kind of easy to think about what this goal is. Perhaps it's about learning Clojure, learning something about Lisp, like the last speaker was talking about. And when it's us ourselves and we're writing the code, when we're writing the code the way that we want to write, it's very easy for us to sort of head towards this goal of some sort. Now, in any significant software system, as you probably know, we don't really work alone. If you think about the number of technologies we have to learn, if you think about sort of JavaScript, HTML, CSS today with the web, maybe about mobile technologies with iOS and Android, it's very difficult to be able to scale software systems and build all applications by ourselves. And so we end up sort of working with other developers and other people as part of that. And when we sort of think about this group of people and this goal, one of the things that we kind of think about as we're maybe leading teams for the first time is that we think, oh yeah, it's really easy. We say, here's the system that we want to build. Maybe we have this nice speech that tells people this is the thing that we're trying to build, it excites people to have that sort of purpose. And, we think that everyone's going to start writing code and understand what that goal is along the way. And we think that everyone else is actually going to get this, and they're actually going to end up with a sort of consistent approach to building code bases. Who's been in a software system where it's always been like this? No hands? Okay. So maybe your experience is a bit more like this, where we get our sort of team together, and we think that, okay, everyone's writing code, and what kind of ends up happening is that people end off going into different paths. So you might hear some developer go, oh, this is my chance to learn React. I'm going to React all the things. And maybe this is somebody's chance to actually learn about automated testing or applying refactorings. And so you get these sort of different priorities, competing priorities, different directions going. And maybe you're not heading towards the same sort of goal. And if you've ever worked on a system like this, which I'm sure all of us have, it ends up being quite frustrating, particularly if you're one of the other developers, right? Because you're sort of thinking, well, why are they working on things like that when we're trying to build this system? And as a leader, if you're sort of leading this sort of team, then you're kind of frustrated as well because you've kind of maybe thought, well, I've already told people what we're trying to build. Why aren't people working towards this? And so I guess this is kind of the first point of being a tech lead, which is thinking about this common goal and common vision that the whole team is moving towards. And it's not something that we can say once and forget. It's something that we actually have to think about all the time, and we kind of end up shepherding. And so, often people go, well, yeah, okay, it's not possible on my kind of code base. And for me, this sort of tweet from a colleague of mine really sums this up. So I had 10 guys on my last project. All of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. So maybe you can recognize this. You go to a different part of your system, and you kind of go, oh yeah, I know who wrote that code. That kind of looks like them. They really love inheritance. I go over here, they really love mocking. There's a lot of interfaces, much more than they really need. And you sort of get to understand that people end up having this sort of small bits of code base that they start to own. And when you're actually thinking about the whole cohesiveness and consistency of a code base, you start to recognize actually nobody's shepherding everyone in the same direction. And for me, this is really the goal of that sort of tech lead. And so we can kind of distill this down into, if you were to say, what's the best way of measuring success as a tech lead? My answer would be this kind of question. So does the code base look like it was written by a single person? That's a good test. Now, it'll never really look exactly the same, so you kind of have to squint a little bit and maybe understand that there's differences between parts of the code base. But what you're really looking for is a sort of cohesiveness of approach, or consistency of approach. So you don't want to have parts of the code base that have deep levels of inheritance, whereas other parts use a lot of composition. You don't want to have parts of the code base which have massive methods with long lines, and other parts of the system where it's like methods of just 5 lines. What you're really trying to do is trying to have a consistent style and approach to developing code. And writing the code is just one side of it. The modeling side is an even harder part. And that's something that Simon was emphasizing in his keynote this morning, which is actually we don't really do enough of this modeling as a group. And so when you're thinking about the concepts in the code, how do people end up applying them within the code base? So do you have a lot of value objects, or do you actually have deep, rich objects that have behavior as well as data? So there's lots of things to look for when you're thinking about this consistency. But as a simple way of distilling down, am I doing a good job as a tech lead? This is a good way of sort of analyzing success. Now, in this talk, I want to kind of give you a sort of simple way of thinking about what should you focus on if you want to get better as being a tech lead. And the sort of acronyms that I kind of like to think about are the 3 Ps. So the first one is thinking about programming. We wouldn't really be a geek's guide to leading teams if we weren't a geek, so there's a programming element to it. There's the people side, and this is probably the one that surprises a lot of people that move into this role for the first time. Is that, we get to program computers, we get to sort of tell compilers what to do. That doesn't really work with people, even if you try. And then we'll have a look at sort of process, which is maybe about some things about dealing with yourself. And we'll look at all of these 3 different areas and find a balance between it. And one of the interesting things as being a sort of seasoned tech lead is that you really want to focus time on all 3 of these elements at different times throughout your sort of week. So the sort of most common mistake of the first-time tech lead is really focusing on my role of being the senior developer, most technical person on the team, and trying to focus on the sort of programming side, but actually they forget about the sort of people and the process and environment. So these are things that you kind of need to find balance for. So let's have a look at programming. So my first question that I get is often, do technical leaders need to code? And my simple answer is yes. The next question is often, well, how much? And my kind of guideline for this is really thinking about a kind of 30% time minimum of spending time in the code base. Now, I've worked with a lot of different clients and organizations, and there's an interesting difference that I often say with technical leaders versus technical managers. So there are some engineering managers who don't necessarily have that maybe background of being a developer. They're a good manager, but they maybe moved away from the code base too much. And what I've noticed working with teams like this is that the relationship with the people writing code and that manager is quite different from a sort of architect who's working with the team writing code. And I've been in a couple of situations where the engineering managers are trying to do the right job, but often what happens is that they kind of have to trust the team, but they don't really know how to call out situations that feel a bit funky. So often you'll have a lot of developers go, oh, we need to spend more time focusing on quality. That's a fair enough reason, right? And you want to support your team, and then the team will say, well, we need a whole week to do this, and that's fine. But then 1 week might turn into 2 weeks, turn into 3 weeks. And if that sort of manager doesn't have that technical background to sort of say, actually, you've only really needed a week because of this task, I don't really understand how this effort on refactoring is actually helping us build our systems, you need that technical background to be able to do that. And so for me, this kind of 30% rule is kind of a good amount, where if you're an effective tech lead, then you really want to be spending some time thinking about at least spending time reading code as well as perhaps writing. Sometimes it may not actually be in sync with developers, so one of the favorite practices I like to use is kind of a loose pair programming model, where I'll work with the developer on the team to sort of help design something, but then I might go break off because as a tech lead, you'll often end up sort of in a lot of meetings, but then you might come back and check in to see how progress goes. I know other tech leads who sort of find ways of doing this through reviewing Git logs, right? So they might, at the end of the day or at the start of the day, go through what's happened and what changes have actually happened in the code base. Maybe there's something peculiar that happened on the sort of last day that you might want to actually ask somebody about, well, why have we taken a new approach to this? Maybe it's about choosing a new technology, and that's a huge surprise, and that has other consequences. And so the really important part of this is really finding ways of keeping your knowledge up to date with the system. Because as the system evolves, there's so many things that can happen, but you want to stay on top of what the biggest risks are. The other aspect to being able to write code is summarized in this really great article, and it was actually published quite a while ago now, so it's, I think, 2009. And it's called The Unspoken Truth About Managing Geeks. What I really love about this article is that he's quite brutally honest about maybe the way that geeks treat other geeks. And he sort of goes on to talk about in this article that respect is the currency of the realm. So you probably know this as a developer, right? Is that if you're working with somebody who, you don't really appreciate their code quality, you might start to maybe move away from working with them because they're starting to create more work for everyone in total. And they kind of go on in this article to say the amount of respect an IT pro pays someone is a measure of how tolerable that person is when it comes to getting things done. And they sort of talk about this weird behavior, this collective attitude that, we'll actually put up with somebody even though, they're a bit rude or they're a little bit brash, but actually they write really great code because we know it's really hard to get really good coders and developers. And so there's this whole level of respect that kind of goes on that developers will treat each other with based on how well they trust you to be able to contribute to the code base. Now, when you're in a sort of position of leadership and this tech lead responsibility, you need to really keep this in mind. And you often think about that sort of post-technical joke. It's often no joke. This is what people actually say as a sort of passive-aggressive statement, is that, oh, you're so post-technical, you don't know actually what's going on in the code base. And so our responsibility as being an effective tech lead is trying to be involved with the code base so that they don't treat us post-technically, so that we can get involved in technical discussions and have that level of respect and rapport with the rest of the team. And, it doesn't mean that you have to be the best developer on the team. And in fact, in a lot of situations, I've found actually the best developer doesn't make the best sort of tech lead because they fail in the sort of the people and the process kind of skills. But it's still important that you have good enough development skills, that you have enough rapport with the team, that you have respect with the rest of the team. So what does a good sort of tech lead focus on if they can sort of code? The first one that I often think about is this thing about consistency over cleverness. It's very easy for developers to pick their most favorite new tool and sort of throw it into the code base. And when you're actually thinking about sort of longevity of systems, you're often thinking about, developers, their contribution, but not only their contribution, but also future generations of developers. So, realistically, most people stay in jobs for about 2 years, and they might work on multiple systems. So you'll end up with a whole bunch of people working on the same system if that system lives for a long time. And one of the things that you really want to think about is, well, if we have 7 different ways of sort of approaching something in the code base, and then we have a new developer sort of join, that leads to 8 different ways, how are they going to be able to make a change easily in the code base? And so this is kind of the whole thing here where we do want clever ways of solving problems, but we don't want it at the cost of consistency. We need to find a good balance of that. So these are the common arguments that every team shouldn't ever have. Tabs or spaces, 2 spaces or 4 spaces, camel case or underscore, brackets or not, and curly brace at the end of the line. And I kid you not, I have seen so many teams waste so much time debating about these, and we're so passionate. And I love this passion, but the interesting thing is that there's so much energy going into these simple things. I've worked on a team where you would have two developers who never ever wanted to talk about this. And they would check out code, they would apply auto format to their own personal preference and check stuff back in. Now imagine having to go back through all the lines of code to actually work out all their commit history, to work out what were the significant changes that they actually did versus all these stylistic changes. And the difficulty is that, as developers, and as people, we kind of want to avoid conflict. So the easiest thing to do is kind of do things ourselves, check it in, we avoid that. Now a tech lead will hopefully pick up where these are differences and create a safe space for the whole team to come to a consensus. And so, an approach that I like to take is, if I notice this happening on a team, get the team together and actually say, look, I've noticed that we have disagreements about tabs and spaces, and we're wasting 2 hours a week always arguing about this. We don't seem to have a way forward. Let's get in a room for an afternoon, and you have to agree on a way forward. Otherwise, if you can't at the end of this meeting, I'm going to put my foot down and say, this is the way that we're going to do it. And the reason that we're trying to do this is not to sort of stamp out individual creativity. It's really to get people to focus on that there are more interesting things to focus on. There are actual business problems out there to solve. There are actual technical problems to solve that we can invest this debating time on rather than over simple, trivial things like formatting. And this is kind of the sort of things that we as tech leads can do to amplify the effectiveness of our developers. So instead of our developers focusing on these formatting issues, they can actually focus on discovering better algorithms to solving the problems that are at hand. Now, there are other things I look for from a programming perspective about the team, and I think about this a lot with team culture. So when I'm thinking about teams, I look at how they behave from a technical perspective, and what's the desire, and what are these behaviors telling me? How many people do continuous integration here? Okay, most. How many have been here where you've been on a team where the build is consistently broken day after day, and nobody's really looking after it? Okay, not so many. I've been on a lot of teams like that, right? But there's something that tells you about the culture that has emerged in that, well, maybe our build isn't so important, and I'm more interested in getting my individual commits in rather than looking after the collective kind of health of the system. And one of the things that if you're thinking about real continuous delivery over continuous integration is really this culture of continuous delivery is keeping the build always in a releasable state so that we can always get things out there. And I want my team to be doing this. So as soon as a build goes broken, I want people to be sort of jumping up and saying, oh, who's fixing it? Do we know what the problem is? And are we on it? I don't really care that the build is actually broken. What I care about is how the team responds to a broken build. Another one is do people avoid conflict? So the real example about people that checking stuff out, checking stuff back in. And I would think that in a team culture, in a healthy team culture, you want people to be able to debate and argue. And I would actually say it's unhealthy if the team never has any debates whatsoever. What is unhealthy is when you can't actually talk about these things, and actually a healthier state is being able to sort of have these in an open forum, but be able to resolve things in a relatively quick way. So I'm a huge fan of conducting spikes. So if you have two sort of developers disagreeing about a technical approach, I often get them to experiment prototyping the other approach, spend a day spiking it out, and then work out using the data about does that actually make sense. And so, these are things that we can do as tech leads to actually create this right behavior. Do people offer new ideas? And the hard thing with our industry is that there's always some new tool, always some new library out there. And one of the things that I'd like people to do is really bring in their passions about what they're interested in and talk about them at work. I want people to sort of say, I've got this side project where I'm learning about maybe machine learning or neural networks, and maybe there's a possibility of applying it here on our sort of project. It may not always line up, but we don't really benefit from a sort of group team diversity unless people are actually offering their ideas. And then do people flag when they kind of need help? So one of the things that I often look for in this is if you do sort of daily stand-ups and the team gets together, I've been in sort of situations where you often hear, my story's almost done, it'll be done today. And then the next day, oh, my story's almost done, it'll almost be done today. And it kind of repeats. And that's telling me something about this sort of team doesn't feel safe saying, actually, I've got a blocker, can somebody actually help me with this? And these are things that I would hope are sort of normal behaviors on a team, or good behaviors of a healthy team. And the big thing here is really thinking about, do people feel like they're okay to admit when they're wrong? The biggest thing that you can do as any leader is actually admitting when you make a mistake, openly. Because that starts to create the environment where it's okay to be wrong. And the thing about technology is that there are many opportunities to be wrong. There are many opportunities for us to break the build, for our ideas not to be right, and actually there are many other better ways of approaching that. And this is the best way that we can actually demonstrate it's okay to be wrong in the team culture that we create. The other thing that I think is really important for a tech lead in the programming sense is really creating that vision. And I think this is where Simon's sort of keynote this morning was really talking about, are we setting the direction of what this landscape should look like, even though we haven't actually begun this journey yet? So I think there's something about reverse generating the sort of direction of, or map of where we are today, but there's also something about creating the future of tomorrow and trying to create a good idea about where we are. And this is a real skill from a lot of you do need to start developing. So, if you haven't actually built anything out, perhaps you're actually trying to, build a microservices architecture with data warehousing and different sort of capabilities. But unless you help people identify what that map could potentially look like, you're going to end up with sort of increments of code, maybe working in the wrong direction, and you're going to end up reacting to that. And so the biggest thing and the biggest value that you can add as a tech lead is actually stating what this vision is. Use the things like the system metaphor from XP to talk about what type of system you're actually trying to build, and get people to sort of understand what the future would actually look like, even if today's reality looks really different. So we've had a look at the sort of programming side. Let's have a look at the people side, which is an often underrepresented side in development. Now, one of the biggest things I think that, it's easy for us to focus on our tools, technologies, but actually for us to get stuff done, we kind of need to understand how people work together. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of places at technical conferences like this that talk about that. So I'll be talking about the people side a little bit more. And what I really like is this idea about strength in diversity. Now, in our industry, we kind of have a tendency to hire people that look like us and think like us. So part of that is often thinking about we want people for this cultural fit. And as a result, we end up sort of finding people that kind of end up looking and culturally feeling like us. And one of the interesting things that a lot of organizational studies have done is actually understand where better problem solving comes from. And this is where diversity comes in. Has anyone done the book StrengthsFinder? If not, it's a really great book. So there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of profile people, but the StrengthsFinder comes from this organization called Gallup. And Gallup does all these organizational surveys of lots and lots of people around the world. And what they actually found out is that they came up with, I think it's about 34 different signature strengths. And if you do this test, so the book comes with like an online survey where you can do this for yourself, you kind of get your top 5 strengths. And what I really like about this book is them talking about, you should be focusing on your strengths and not your weaknesses. One of the interesting things that we can do is, what are the areas that we should improve on? And we can really focus on that all the time. But actually, one of the interesting things about the StrengthsFinder stuff is actually saying, we do need to work on weaknesses when they sort of hold us back. But actually, we're a lot much more effective when we apply our strengths. One, because we tend to be a lot more successful. And so we have this positive feedback loop where, we're doing something that we feel that we're kind of good at, so we do more of it. And therefore, we get more experience with it. We get better at it. We get stronger at that. And that's the idea behind the StrengthsFinder. And the interesting thing is that there's lots of different strengths out there, but we all have different mixes of them. And as a tech lead, one of the things I'm really looking for is making sure that the team that I have has a mix of different strengths to draw upon from. So I'll use a couple of examples in the book here. So the first one is about WOO. So WOO is the short acronym for winning others over. Perhaps you know about people like this. They come on stage and they can sort of convince people that they've never talked to before to follow them to do something crazy. So apparently only 2% of the population actually has this character strength. And they're really, important strengths if you really want to influence people, particularly outside of the team, to maybe take on time to spend on maybe technical debt refactoring, or to take the opportunity and risk to use a new technology. So people who have this WOO strength are really useful, but your team may not actually have a person with that strength. Analytical people are, this strength is this thing where people need to think about lots of different scenarios and all the things that could possibly go wrong. So this is really great if you're doing things like setting up production infrastructure or doing site reliability architecture, because you can think about all the possible things that might actually go wrong and be a lot more robust about that. An activator is like one of the strengths that gets other people excited and energized about stuff. So you might have somebody who has woo that convinces somebody to, apply and start using React, but it's not very useful if only one person on the team is actually using it. You kind of want everyone to get excited about this for that sort of consistency to spread. And so this is where the activator strength kind of comes in. You have intellection people, and perhaps you're one of these people yourselves, where they kind of theorize about the would-bes and the philosophies, about the code behavior and the models. And these are really great sort of strengths to draw upon when you're tackling gnarly domain problems and interactions between different parts of the system. You have achievers, and achievers are kind of these people where you have this ability to sort of want to always complete things. So you want to have a sense of progress. Achievers typically have a relentless task list where they love really striking things out and making progress on. And then you have strategic people who aren't thinking about today's kind of world, but actually thinking about the world in maybe a year or so. So, it's thinking about, is cloud going to be the next thing for your application right now? Or is something else going to be that? Should we be adopting Docker, looking at new technologies, not on the landscape today, but what things we might possibly look at in the future? And then input are people who have this ability to sort of bring things together. Now, the difficulty with strengths is that there's a whole wide variety of them. And strengths can also be kind of a typical source of conflict as well. And there's nothing really bad about one strength or the other. The classic example or consultant answer is that it depends. So a really great example that often happens is if you have a pairing situation where you get somebody who has either an analytical or an intellection kind of strength working with an achiever. Achiever's this person that just want to get stuff done. They just want to start writing code. They want to see something working. Whereas you have somebody who needs to think about the problem a lot more, who needs time to sort of model and digest and think about different ways. It's kind of get a natural tension of them working together that, if you didn't actually talk to people about different strengths, they just sort of see, they, approach problems differently, so I don't want to work with them. And actually, one of the greatest things that we can do as a group is actually explore each other's strengths and appreciate people for the things that they bring into the team as well. So, in that sort of situation, just having the other person understand they have a different way of approaching the problem might lead them to working differently together. So they might say, okay, well, I know that you need some time to think about something, so maybe we break apart for a half day, we kind of think about how we might approach it. I might go prototype some code, then we come back together and see how things have actually gone. And actually just talking about people's different strengths and recognizing this is a really great way of getting people to collaborate a lot more together. The other thing is trying to be aware of your collective group strengths. So, if you have a whole bunch of people who only have woo and analytical abilities, you'll probably never get anything delivered. You kind of need people who have an achiever strength to make sure that there's a progress, right? So you'll have people that love talking about stuff, maybe excite other people about that, but things won't get done. And so this is where we as tech leads kind of want to care about having a diverse group of strengths. And because each person will only have sort of top 5 strengths, you want to make sure that everyone understands what things are out there and how you work together and in which situations that kind of makes sense. Now, this book is just one sort of example of a model that talks about different ways of doing this. I know organizations that also do this system called human dynamics, which talk about different approaches to problem solving. And there's another one called Belbin. So if you're interested in about how you get teams to work better together and to identify maybe personal preferences and how people appreciate their different styles, there are 3 different ways that you can actually do that as well. And I talk about diversity, but a lot of this stuff actually comes from academic studies as well. So there's a study which was talking about Fortune 500 companies, talking about the board representation of sort of females. And so when they actually had 3 or more women on the board, the organizations that had that on the board actually gained a huge amount in terms of return on sales, return on equity, and return on invested capital. And one of the reasons that comes down to it is because you have a different way of problem solving. So the problems with not having diversity is that you become blindsided. You become sort of the single voice, but it means that you end up sort of not thinking about the things that are outside of the things you would normally think about. And by having a different perspective, by having a different sort of strength, you sort of widen the view of what possible ways that you might actually think about problems and tackle that. So this one was from 2007, and a more recent one in 2012 was talking about just one board representative being female. So an all-male one was 12%, and you end up getting an increase on return on equity by 4% more with just one female representation. Now, it's really important not to think about diversity just in terms of gender, but also in terms of backgrounds as well. So obviously, you can think about diversity in terms of problem solving and programming languages. So, people who have a functional thinking background will bring in a lot of different sort of thinking. People who come from sort of different backgrounds of studies, so, electrical engineering all the way to computer science, through to the more human or arts-based degrees, they all bring different ways of problem solving together. And these are types of diversities that we should be really looking for when we're thinking about our team composition. And this book by Scott Page talks about the mathematical way of proving why diversity works. And he kind of talks about this. He has quite a complicated formula, which gets distilled down to this collective accuracy being the average accuracy plus the diversity. So if you think about this, if we have a whole bunch of random people that we pull off the street together and say, now build a software system, you're probably not going to get a great system because they don't have that background, and that's the average accuracy. So you kind of need people who have some level of that ability, but the teams who have that sort of average level of ability already with programming, but they have a much more diverse sort of set of backgrounds, ends up solving problems a lot more effectively. But there is a caveat to this, and this is where our role as tech leads sort of come in, which is you need to be able to integrate these collective opinions. So this is where we were coming back to the sort of first part of the talk, where I was talking about you don't want to have 7 different ways, all expressed in the code base. You really want to be able to sort of surface all these different ways of solving a problem, but be able to choose a single way of actually going ahead. And as tech leads, one of the best ways that we can do this is, once again, relying on data and prototyping for doing this. So this is a really great example where a lot of companies go through, if you're doing A/B testing, there's a really great way of actually saying, here's different ways of solving stuff. We collect some data about how it actually works, and then we make a choice as to integrating that into our solution based on evidence that we have. And we can take this approach with the teams that we build as well. Now, with people, it's often, who's been on a team building event of some sort? Okay, yeah. Maybe you do some sort of high ropes or you go off. I'm a big fan of some of the social activities. I don't think it's so effective for building teams. Now, one of the reasons for this, I've found in my experience, is teams go off, you have a bit of fun, but when you go back to the sort of groups and your environment in which you're working in, you maybe socially have known people a lot more, but everyone maybe falls back into their old relationships of how things have actually happened. And one of the biggest things that we can think about as sort of leaders is thinking about this idea of building trust building in every day or every week into the activities that we do. And there's a lot of different ways that we can actually achieve that. So, trying to encourage people to sit together for lunch. I don't know what it's like here, but there's a big difference in the UK, where I normally work, and Germany, where I'm currently working, where teams will actually go and sit down to lunch together. And actually through the conversations, you have some social sort of bindings, but some work topics will often come up as well. And you can sort of build up that trust over time. And I think what I've found really fascinating is that the teams that tend to go to lunch together versus teams that maybe grab a sandwich and go back to their desk, is that they tend to be a lot more cohesive and they understand each other a lot more. If we can get people to sort of do these insights tests and get people to share those results as well about personal preferences, that's another really great way of actually building up trust. It also kind of exposes a little bit of vulnerability, which is a really essential part of building up trust. In that, when you say, these are my strengths, at the same time, you're kind of saying, these aren't my strengths. And in a way, they're my weaknesses. And by talking about some of that and being open about that, it helps build up trust amongst the team as well. Another great practice that I like to do with teams is kind of this thing about sort of needs and offerings, right? So in some teams, you might have some people who've never ever done really well done domain-driven design, but you might have other people on the team who have been real experts in that, and they can share some of that knowledge. And so you're trying to connect people up with the different things that they offer and the things that they'd like to grow in as well. And that builds up trust. And this brings us up onto our next point, which is thinking about how you grow people. I alluded to this before where, the average career span in IT is about 2 years. I don't know what it's like here in this country, but definitely in the US or in the UK, it's around 2 years. And one of the things that we need to think about is people who get bored with their jobs will quit. And that's kind of something that's a bit scary if you're leading a team, right? So you want to have a nice cohesive team where people feel like they're growing, but what can you do to actually help influence that? And there's a really nice model that I like to use called the situational leadership model that talks about this. So what often happens is thinking about a challenge of a task and the skill or ability of a person. And this comes in from a book called Flow, where if you give somebody a new task for the first time they've never done, and you sort of say you have to do that by yourself, they're going to get really anxious. So, something that you've never ever done before. But at the same time, if you're a web developer and you have to write another sort of web page, you're kind of going to get bored, right? So you kind of need this human variety of different things that you've never done before. And throughout this kind of sort of journey, what you end up having is kind of this channel of flow, where by the time that we actually are given something that we've never done before, we're maybe a bit anxious, but if we can actually learn how to do that, we kind of get this buzz. We've solved a new problem, we've learned something, and we get into this flow state. At the same time, if we keep doing that same task over and over, we kind of end up not improving our skills, and we kind of get bored. And so we kind of need this constant challenge of new things to do all the time in order to sort of boost us into this flow zone. And so as tech leads, one of the things that we can really do is trying to think about how do we expose people to new opportunities that they've never had, where it gives them a chance to actually grow as well. And so, there's lots of things that we can do, even if the tasks remain the same, by getting people to maybe try things out they've never really done before. So, maybe it's a back-end developer that's actually having a go at trying to play around with CSS or something with iOS or Android. Perhaps it's about somebody who's never dealt with the build and DevOps kind of infrastructure and actually learning something new there as well. The great thing about our industry is that there's always something new to learn that's new, and so there's always opportunities for us to grow as sort of individuals. And as tech leads, we can encourage people to maybe try something out that they've never done before. We can give people some support so that they're not so anxious, and actually say, check in with them all the time to make sure that they have an ability to grow. And this is where you're thinking about how you maximize the potential from the team, right? So you're thinking about individuals, and I would highly recommend this if you're leading a team now, to think about, from an individual perspective, do you have a good understanding about that person, from what skills that they have, and what skills that they bring in? What are their sort of strengths, and what do they like doing? What are their goals? So in the next year, where would they like to improve themselves? And what are they interested outside of work that they might be able to bring in? And once you actually start to know all of these sort of profile attributes of people on your team, what you're trying to find is this kind of sweet spot of opportunity, right? So if you know that somebody wants to start playing around with a new technology, and there's an opportunity for them to start taking on ownership of that, perhaps it's them about leading something, this gives them a chance to actually grow and apply all of these things. And the better thing is that you're actually going to get a lot more of a better result as a result, because they're really interested in doing this, right? So it's something that it's aligned with what they're good at, something that they're allowed to grow in, and they have the opportunity to do that as well. So, we can actually influence some of these things as well. We can make sure that people get sent on training courses, go to conferences like this. We can actually get people excited about new things as well. So think about how you get people excited about new technologies or something outside. And maybe you can also help people establish goals. And through this, you get to understand the profile of the team that you're actually working with as well. Part of growing teams is also thinking about how we amplify the learnings of the team throughout. And this is where I often look at teams and think about how many learning activities are they actually doing at a consistent basis. Now, some teams will spontaneously do this because some developers are really passionate about some of these things, but there are other teams where none of this happens because nobody's looking after this. And one of the biggest things as a tech lead is that, if nobody's looking after it, nobody else will, except for you. And so this is where you have an ability to actually influence this as well. So think about some of the different ways that you might amplify knowledge across your sort of team. So think about doing team code reviews. So to open something up and maybe group collaboratively refactor something to understand what are the pain points and how you might approach solving that. Think about pair programming or brown bags, about way that you can sort of spread sort of knowledge throughout. So a brown bag session is a lunchtime session where people often bring their lunch, and maybe you talk about something, or you show a conference video, or you sort of get somebody to do a presentation, and that way you're sort of sharing knowledge as well. Yeah, and also spike showcases. So often thinking about, as somebody is trying something out as a prototype, they've learned a lot along the way. And there's a lot of value in actually just showcasing that back to the team and saying, here's what they've found out, and you're amplifying those kind of learnings. Now, the biggest thing about teams is that people are difficult, and they don't always work out. And the biggest thing that I can tell you, a secret, is really being aware of the bad apple. So sometimes it's okay to think about you've done everything you can to help the team and every individual in the team, but sometimes somebody's not really going to work out. And one of the greatest, I guess, pieces of power that you have as a leader is your ability to sort of compose your team. And part of that composing is also being able to perhaps let somebody go who isn't fitting in that team. I wouldn't say that this is your sort of first act that you should have when something's not working out, but it is something as a backup power that you should remember that you have in order to affect the better team overall. And so one of the things about sort of bad influences, and what you're looking for is kind of people who are constantly negative, people who can't contribute but won't work with other people, and really want to go fly solo. And these are people that, if you've given them feedback, if you've worked with them over a long time, they start to maybe think about how they're affecting the rest of the team. And this is where you really should be stepping in. So it's actually often worse as a leader not to do anything than to actually do something about that. And often if you find that you end up sort of removing a bad apple, and it may not necessarily be asking them to leave the company, but maybe finding a different role for them or a different opportunity for them to work in the way that they'd like to work, you'll actually have a much better impact for the team overall. And so one of the things that you're really thinking about is not optimizing for an individual, but you're really trying to optimize for the team as a whole. So remember that you have this backup reserve process that you can draw upon if need be. Which leads us on to our sort of third section, which is thinking about the process. And this is often where a lot of people sort of feel, I don't really have the ability to tell people what to do. And one of the things that you can is actually draw upon this ability, and that comes with the authority of being a tech lead. Now, you shouldn't be doing this all the time, and this is where the depends comes in. And this is where it comes down to this situational leadership model, which is thinking about how much support you give somebody versus how much directing behavior you have. And people go through like this cycle, you want to go from directing all the way back to sort of supporting, depending on the sort of person and the activity at hand. So you might go from directing through to sort of coaching, to supporting, and delegating. And you would do this depending on what the task is. And the way to think about this is, if you've ever worked with fresh people who've come out from university, or really excited people who've never done a lot of sort of programming, they'll be really excited, but they won't really know how to solve problems at the beginning, right? So there's so much to learn. And actually, this is where your directing behavior kind of makes a lot of sense. And it really is thinking about how developed are they in the skills required to achieve a particular task. And so in this kind of example, the people who are really excited, they have high commitment, right? Because they're enthused by the task. They're enthused by something new, but they haven't got that background yet. And this is where actually by directing them, you're helping them to break down the problem step by step. You're not necessarily telling them exactly what to type into your sort of IDE, but you're actually helping them problem solve a lot more. Now, as they develop skill over time, you'll end up with having some low to sort of moderate skill, but maybe they don't really understand why they're actually doing things. And this is where coaching actually helps as well, right? So if you keep telling somebody what to do, they're going to get frustrated at some point because they'll be thinking, well, I know how to solve this problem, but there's a part that's missing for me. And this is where you need to sort of switch modes with that person, which is maybe stop telling them what to do and ask them questions and find out what they would do for themselves, what parts they're actually having problems with, and help them find ways to actually solve that as well. And this is where your coaching mode kind of comes in. Your supporting mode is kind of this thing where you actually have moderate to high competency, but you kind of have a variable commitment. So a really good example is where you have seasoned developers tackling something, but they don't really want to because they don't really understand why. And so supporting might involve actually sitting with these sort of developers and actually saying, this piece that needs to be developed is actually really a critical part of our system. We're under sort of crunch time, and so I would give it to somebody else who maybe hasn't had a chance to actually do anything in this area, but it's going to take a lot longer. So it's really important for this time that somebody who has that experience does that, even though I know that you've done this several times before. And this is where you might help that person, give them maybe more help through another developer or pairing them with somebody else who has that experience. But you're trying to support them in actually understanding why the task that they're doing is really important, even though you know that they're actually capable of doing it. And the goal of this is really to move people to a place where you can actually delegate a lot of things, right? So where you don't have to worry about how something is going to be done, but you can actually say, here are the things that need doing, and you are confident that these people have the ability to actually deliver this on, as needed as well. Now, one of the questions that I often get is, why is the arrow sort of moving backwards to this direction? And this is where, as you sort of get to know people and their sort of skills and abilities, and depending on what things are actually coming out, you sort of want to move people from directing all the way to a delegating stage. So you're sort of moving people through, stop telling people what to do, through to a place where you trust people to actually get things done that need doing. And this is where we have to watch out for our own behaviors as tech leads, which is if we're constantly telling people what to do, that leads to a bad habit where we can get stuck into this mode. And it's really important that we draw upon these 4 different modes when we're interacting with people, depending on what things need doing. The final model around process is also thinking about really team development. And Tuckman's model talks about the stages of team formation. So when you sort of get a group of people together, they're not always a team. So often I go into organizations and people say, oh, this team is working on this over here. And then I go sit with those people and ask them what they're doing, and I actually find out they're all working on different tasks with different goals. So that's not a team at all. So a team is actually a group of people working towards a common goal. So they need to have a purpose to work together. But when you actually get people working together for the first time, you're going to get a whole bunch of different things happening. So formation is the first part. So we get a whole bunch of people together, we set a purpose for them. What will normally happen is that people start to understand how other people in the group work, what they bring in, and this leads to a natural storming stage. And this is where you get a lot of conflict. And this is where I actually often see a lot of teams stuck, because they kind of can't really resolve this conflict. So they might find out that actually somebody doesn't ever want to work in the office and they want to work from home. But what that means is they end up sort of carving off sections of the code base where they get to work by themselves. And it's then hard for other people to maybe interact with that code and have an ability to influence that. And so the team starts to storm. And this is where we, as sort of tech leads, start to need to recognize these parts of conflicts and actually try to resolve some of these things. So this is the point where we'd be looking out for people checking code in and out, reformatting things, trying to really trigger some way of discussing the conflicts that are happening, but also finding a way to actually resolve them. And this is where you start to get into the norming stage. So one of the things that we can do as a sort of tech lead is talk about group standards, team standards. What are we going to agree on? How do we work with each other? Who's going to be doing what different tasks depending on what skills need doing? So roles and responsibilities. And this is where, if we don't do this, teams won't really do this by themselves. And so we can actually help accelerate this process as well and make sure it happens. Now, the interesting thing is, in this sort of Tuckman's model, is you don't really get the benefits of teams until you actually get through these stages. And this is where you get to the performing stage, right? And so if you've ever been in a high-performing team, maybe you can know how that feels, right? So everyone gets along really well together. You know who to go for help. And it feels like things are just constantly happening. You get a sense of pride about the things that you're working with, and you really enjoy coming to work each day. Now, if you're stuck in a team which is constantly storming, these are probably teams that you kind of dread turning up the next day, or you know that some conflict's going to happen, and you're kind of going to put your heads down and focus on the code that you're writing. And this is where, where the organization's not getting the benefits of the team. Now, they revised this model after the model was actually produced, and they talked about this adjourning stage. And this often happens, when a key member of that team kind of leaves. And it's often, the case where there's a cake, a send-off, maybe there's a sort of party or something like that. And this is actually a sort of mourning phase as well, right? And this is kind of recognizing that actually the team's composition has changed. And the biggest takeaway from this is knowing that if somebody joins or leaves a team, this whole process gets reset all over again. So maybe that person was maybe the social glue that kept the team together, going out to lunch all the time. And when that person leaves, there's suddenly a vacant gap, and people feel like there's something missing. And this is a trap that we can fall into as sort of tech leads, where we ignore the fact that somebody's leaving or somebody's joining. We actually end up with a very different team altogether. And we need to watch out that we'll go through this phase all over again. Now, all of these things are models, and one of my favorite quotes comes from a statistician called George E.P. Box. And so, essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so, all of these sort of tools and models that I've given you are actually really great ways of looking at your role as a tech lead and understanding how you can be a lot more effective. It'll never be perfect, but you have a broader toolkit to draw upon as a result of. And my final tip for you is really thinking about how you make time for yourself. So often when you're in this leadership role, and anyone knows what this is like, you get countless invites to meetings. You'll find that you have lots of things to do that drag you away from the code. And actually, what you really should be doing is trying to make sure that you have some time to spend thinking about what's essential for you as a tech lead to focus on. And this is where I really encourage people actually blocking out thinking time. So thinking out time to think about where do you prioritize, where you spend your time to have the most impact on the team or on the code base, or what are the hottest priorities that you should focus on for the next week or 2 weeks. So a really good example is thinking about maybe planning time at the beginning of a week as new things sort of come in, and sort of planning time at the end of the week to think about what are the things that you need to spend your time in. Is it more time working with developers and getting them to have this cohesive vision? Or is it actually about trying to think about people problems that you're actually thinking about? But the important thing is making sure that you have some space to actually think about these problems. Otherwise, you just end up reacting. So we've explored this 3 Ps, programming, people, process, of being the Geek's Guide to leading teams. And I can only encourage you to find ways to actually practice this and say that it's not an easy journey, but it is a really satisfying one if you can do it well. Thank you very much. And we have some time for questions. And
almost there. So I will take one question from Slido, and then we'll have 2 questions from the audience. Okay, quite short. So there is a nice question from Slido. All are great, but I will take this fantastic one. Speaking about encouraging learning, what is your personal opinion on mob programming? You do learning, but you are stealing an hour from the team members. So can you elaborate about what is mob programming maybe? And
right, so mob programming comes from the idea of, I guess the XP idea is that if you do something and it's good, do more of it. And so XP took the idea of code reviews to pair programming, and I guess mob programming is another extension of if pair programming is good, why can't we do this as a group as well? And I've done this a couple of times, and I actually find it really useful of actually building a cohesive sort of sense of how you build software. And I find it's actually a really great way around where you have those differences in the code base, particularly around how you model a particular problem. So I think it's actually a really good practice. I think it's just difficult to sometimes justify depending on your organization. So there's a company called Unruly in the UK that does only mob programming because their management have really bought into the idea around that sort of stuff. And I think one of the skills that you have to develop as a sort of tech leader is actually these influencing skills to be able to convince non-technical people to allow you space and time to do these sorts of things. So I think the most challenge that people will have, and I have this with our clients as well, is that the normal modus operandi is developers working by themselves, maybe doing code reviews. Pair programming is often a hard choice because a lot of management think, well, I'm dividing the number of people, so I end up with less code written, so I end up with less features. And I think that perception is also done with mob programming. So I think my perception is, like, I really like it as a practice. In reality, in most organizations, it's difficult to sell without that sort of management buy-in, but there are places where it's possible.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, 2, okay. Yeah, go ahead. Just catch the microphone. Ready?
Okay? Okay. It's nice. Okay, a question. I was in a team that after like 2.5 years decided to not have anymore a team leader because we get function without team leader. It was really performing team and we decided to do like this. Then I got moved to another team where I am the team leader now.
Yep.
And the last thing that you talk about, making time for yourself, it's really not easy. And one of my solutions was to like involve people of my team in meetings to delegate them part of my tasks. But to let them grow, not to just list me of stuff to do. The thing is that I don't think that most of them are really interested in that part of the business. Do you think there is some way to encourage this type of interest in that topic?
Yeah, so I have a couple of comments about that one. So I think the first one is I see this sort of role of a tech lead, team lead as being a sort of role. And the thing about roles is they're just more of a collection of responsibilities. Now, in most organizations, it's sort of nominated for a person because that person is accountable to make sure those things happen. Now, in the sort of first team case where you didn't really need that role is because all those responsibilities were actually taking place. And I think that's a really healthy place to be where maybe people are really passionate about that and they've delegated that and all of those things are happening. So the work of that person who's accountable doesn't need to make sure that happens by them doing it themselves. I think the problem is often where there isn't a tech lead, but nobody's doing any of those things, which is maybe that second case where nobody's interested in perhaps organizing brown bag sessions. Nobody wants to do team code reviews because they want to focus on their own individual problem of writing the code that they want to have. And this is where I think in those situations you kind of do need a tech leader because those responsibilities aren't actually happening. So I think that you can have some teams where you don't have to have that role. I think that's rarer than the case where you do. Because I think in my experience, a lot of these skills aren't things that developers naturally have. It's not something you practice day to day. And so it's important to have somebody who focuses on that to make sure it happens as well. So in that kind of case, as a tech lead, I'd be trying to encourage and look for people who have interests in maybe doing some of the things. We can spread out some of those responsibilities and then grow them such to the point where you can delegate some of those things. But it'll depend on your people about how much interest they have. So I've been on teams where they really just want to focus on the sort of team side, and they'll be really happy to take part in meetings that you organize, like team code reviews or brown bags, but they don't want to organize it themselves. And so you have to find a way of making sure it happens, and if the team doesn't want to do it, then you end up still having to organize that.
Thank you. One more, the last question before we go to lunch on the left side, right? Are you ready to catch this box? Let's check your reaction.
Well, good there.
Hey. Thanks, Patrick, for a great speech. In the first section of the programming, you described the way to solve the problem with, I guess it was brackets or something. This was a kind of democratic way. I have another opinion. What if you just say that, like, yeah, from now on, we just continue with brackets on the same line, or like spaces or whatever. So without any discussions. To my opinion, well, like these questions aren't really that important as you are a tech leader. Is that for you? Or try to prove me wrong?
Yeah, so there's another model which I didn't really talk about, which is about decision making. And when you make a choice about whether or not you step in and say, this is going to be the way that I choose it to be, versus you asking sort of input for other people, is kind of a question of how much buy-in you want from the team to do that. And so in that sort of situation, I'd be thinking about what's the consequences of me saying this is how it's going to be done, because in reality, you kind of, in a code standards perspective, if people are going to continue doing what they were doing, even though you said that, you kind of need some way of having follow-up. And so when you're actually looking to make sure that there's buy-in, I'd be trying to make sure that there's as much input and time from the team and buy-in to the process as much as possible versus actually having the sort of, here's my choice. There are some other situations where you can sort of say, here's my choice, because the team doesn't need to really be bought in. So a really good example is if you're going out to lunch and every day you want to ask people, where do we want to go for lunch today? Nobody really cares often, and you can actually say, actually, we're going to go here today, and most people go with it, right? Whereas if it's something that's going to be a long-lasting decision, that's going to affect how people write code, design things, and how they work together, I'm trying to spend a lot more time on that so people feel more involved as part of that process so that they have that behavior. So I want people to think about not just what, but why, and they've been part of that process so there's as much buy-in as possible. So in those sorts of decision-making kind of alternatives, I'd be thinking about that trade-off between time to make a decision and also the buy-in from the team that I want.
So in case of those spaces, would you consider that as an important process for your team?
I would say so if the team is really passionate about arguing about it. But I think this is where there's that trade-off where you give people the opportunity to come to an agreement. They have that time, but there is also a time limit to it as well. So this is where you're trying to balance the two, where there will be a decision made if the group can't come to a consensus, and that's how it's going to be.
All right, thank you.
Cool.
Oh, man.
Thank you, Patrick. Awesome talk. Woo! Thank you.